All right, thanks for coming. My name is Dale Tuggy. Appreciate everybody coming out on this very English night. And my talk is called Why I Am Not a Buddhist. And despite my politically incorrect advertising sign, I do have a lot of respect for Buddhist philosophy, Buddhist traditions, Buddhist people. It's the fourth biggest religion in the world. You can't get to be fourth biggest religion in the world unless there is a lot of good things about your religion, unless it works pretty well for people. It has to fit with human nature well enough for it to become that popular. So I'm just going to assume all that. What I'm going to do is I'm going to show love and respect like a philosopher does, which is trying to carefully understand you and then have an argument with you. So that's what I'm going to do. It's based on about 15 years of trying to understand Buddhist philosophy and religion, and it's based on respect. But obviously, you can tell by the title, they haven't made the sale in my case. Okay, so why not? Well, I mean, one reason they haven't made the sale is because Buddhism is a religion, and I've already got a religion, and mine isn't compatible with Buddhism. And I think I needed to start off by saying this because sometimes people think Buddhism is just a philosophy or actually kind of just a hobby. But you know, when you really dig into historical Buddhism, Asian Buddhism, even Western Buddhism, it's really not intended to be a hobby. It's supposed to be something that you really kind of found your life on. There are a lot of myths floating around about it, that it's just the science of the mind, that it's just the practice of sitting meditation so that you can be less stressed out and more compassionate. Look, sitting meditation was not practiced by lay Buddhists, as I understand, until just before the 20th century. So, right, lay people didn't do that. They wouldn't presume to do that. Even most Buddhist monks and nuns didn't really focus on sitting meditation in most Buddhist traditions, the exception being Chan and Zen Buddhism. To sort of focus on that one practice as if that's kind of what it's all about, I think is not right. Some people think it's a foundation for environmentalism because it says that all things in the cosmos are interconnected. I don't know. See what you think after I talk a little bit about the diagnosis and cure in a minute. So, I mean, I think Buddhism is something to be taken seriously. It's one of the great intellectual traditions of humankind. It's not just a fun little thing to play around with. I was interviewing a very distinguished scholar of Buddhism once, and he remarked to me that people say, I'm into Buddhism, but they don't say, I'm into Roman Catholicism. That's interesting. Or I'm really into Methodism, or I'm into Islam. Why is that? I don't know. Buddhism occupies a certain sort of niche in our marketplace for religions where people think it's something to sort of be a hobby or a side interest. But that's not how most Buddhists have taken it in history. So maybe the most fundamental reason why I haven't bought into Buddhism myself is that I don't accept any diagnosis and cure. So when I think about religions are multifaceted. Religions have an experiential component, an artistic component, a social component, a ritual component, and so on. But what I think is really fundamental to any religious tradition, and which is the part that I think that without understanding this, you really don't get the tradition. I think the core of it really is a diagnosis and a cure. So in other words, a diagnosis of what the fundamental problem is that faces human beings. You know, what is it at bottom that is really messed up about us? And there's different diagnoses that different religions give. And then there's a cure, and a cure is supposed to be a way to positively and permanently resolve whatever that problem was. And so one way to understand religions is to compare them in terms of a diagnosis and cure. Now, when I read the oldest Buddhist texts that are in the Pali language, I come up with something like what you see here. The diagnosis is that you're trapped in samsara. Samsara is the realm of rebirth. It's the cosmos, basically, the world that you see around you. And this is because of craving or strong desire. And the cure is that you follow the Dharma, follow the Buddha's teaching completely, follow the practice completely, which will stop craving and which will bring you to nirvana. And it ain't easy to say what nirvana is supposed to be. The early texts portray it as something sort of indescribable, although they give a lot of different metaphors for it, the far shore and so on, pure bliss. But anyway, whatever nirvana is, it entails that you're no longer trapped in the cycle of rebirth. Okay, but that's not the only Buddhist diagnosis and cure. If you read some Mahayana texts, so I have in mind especially texts like the Vimalakirti Sutra, you get something like this. The diagnosis is that you think distinctions are real and that realities are many, and the cure is that you need to stop thought gradually over time by long practice usually, and this will put you in touch with the one reality that there really is, which goes by various names like your true mind or the Buddha nature. Sometimes they call it nirvana and so on. Now, just a logical point, if you look at these the pairs of diagnoses and the pairs of cures, they're not compatible with one another. They can't both be true. And if your religious background is, say, Christianity or Islam, you might say, well, how can one single religion have multiple diagnoses and cures? I mean, isn't there just sort of one message per religion, or you could say one theology per religion? Well, no. I mean, this is why there's such great differences between different Buddhist traditions. Some scholars talk about Buddhist religions. They talk about Buddhism as a family of interrelated religions. And part of the reason is that when you get these really deep down differences between them, right? If it's a mistake to make distinctions between things, it's a mistake to make a distinction between samsara and nirvana. And a mistake to make a distinction between being trapped in rebirth and not. And so Buddhist philosophers through the centuries have had a lot of interesting arguments back and forth about these rival claims. Okay. I want to give some historical background about Buddhism and explain, why there is such profound differences in the messages that they're giving you. And I'm going to put it a little controversial and say it's been hijacked 3 times. Okay, but to explain how that happened, I need to give you some historical background. So most of us think that Gautama was a real person. And the traditional date of his death is 486. Scholars have wondered quite a bit about this. Some think he died somewhat later than that. And the earliest texts, as I mentioned before, are in the Pali language. And we think they were written down sometime in the 1st century BC in Sri Lanka, that big island off the tip of India. Okay, so that's, now we don't have, the original manuscripts. This is not unusual for ancient texts. We have, medieval versions of them as edited later on. But anyway, I'm not here to argue that you should be skeptical that there was a Buddha. I think there was a Buddha. I mean, I think it sounds like it came from one guy, ultimately. I think it's possible to be too skeptical about these sorts of things. So the Buddha, according to all the traditional stories, lived and died somewhere in northeast India, around here. And then the earliest surviving texts that we have were, we think, written down here about 300 years after his death, or maybe even a little bit more than that. So what's this talk about hijacking? Well, archaeologists have pointed out for a long time that early Buddhists did not make images of the Buddha, because we don't have any images of the Buddha from earlier than about the 1st century, right around the time of Christ, maybe a little before, maybe a little bit after. And so I know the term idolaters is a loaded term. If you don't like that term, substitute iconophile, or image-liking people. Any kind of Asian Buddhism involves institutionalized honoring of images. And yes, I know they don't think they're worshiping the piece of wood. They think they're worshiping the being that's in the piece of wood once it's properly dedicated and the eyes are painted on it and it goes through this dedication ceremony and so on. Yeah, they don't think that piece of wood or stone is the Buddha. Yeah, I know, but this is honoring images, and some religions are for that sort of thing. Well, most of them are for it, and some are against it. Apparently, early Buddhism was against it because they didn't do it. This is a picture of the earliest surviving image of the Buddha that we have. I've also read, although I haven't read the original text myself, but I've read that there are surviving texts which are arguments between Buddhists in the 1st century AD about whether it's appropriate to make images of the Buddha. And some said yes, and some said no. Honestly, early Buddhists were a very argumentative bunch. They disagreed about all kinds of things. The history is very interesting. Most of the groups that have existed in ancient times kind of died out eventually. Okay, so he dies maybe 486, maybe later, earliest image 30 BC. So, there's at least 3 centuries here where they're not making images of the Buddha. All right, well, the early Buddhists that did not think it was proper to honor images of the Buddha, they lost, okay? Because since then, the Buddha is arguably the most idolized person in the history of the world. If you just were to count up all the Buddha statues, I don't think you'd find as many of any other person. And it's very central to practice of almost any kind of Buddhism, except some modernist Buddhism, especially is found in the West. Second hijacking occurred when these new Mahayana Sutras popped up about 400 or 500 years late to the party. They claim to be sutras, so a sutra is a discourse like a sermon. If you read the oldest, the Pali Canon sutras, they always start off, or almost always, thus have I heard while the Buddha was at, thus and such place, and it might say who was there, it might say who it is that's reporting this. And the early sutras were memorized by monks, it seems. And when you read them, they look like they were meant to be memorized because they're very repetitive and have a lot of lists and so on. Now, when you read Mahayana Sutras, first of all, they're very late to the party. Second, they're in a different language. They're in Sanskrit, which at the time was a prestigious traditional Indian language. So like if you're going to try to fake the Bible, let's say in the 1800s, you're going to come up with a new Bible or new lost books of the Bible, let's say. What you're going to do is you're going to write that in King James English. You're going to write it in the sort of fancy, old-timey English that people expect when they read the Bible, right? Actually, this has been done, but I digress. This is not a hypothetical example. Right, so that's what they did. They didn't use the language the Buddha spoke, which we think was Prakrit. They didn't use Pali. They used Sanskrit, this prestigious language. And the style is just wildly different. One Buddhist scholar friend of mine described it as akin to sci-fi or fantasy writing. I would call the style fantastical. Like, they're not realistic. They're way too long to be memorized in a lot of cases, and they have lots of supernatural beings hanging around of all different sorts. And maybe most importantly, like the teaching is just a whole different ballgame than what you find in the early texts. And so these were controversial for centuries, and these Mahayana texts contain arguments against the early Buddhist message. And I don't know if you've heard of the doctrine of expedient means. Expedient means is when a wise and enlightened being says things that are untrue to a particular audience, because being so wise, he knows that these untrue teachings will be helpful to those people where they're at. So I guess it's kind of like telling 5-year-olds that the stork brings babies or something, because if you tell them the real story, they'll be like, oh my gosh. Like, if you're a 3-year-old, says, where does babies come from? Well, let me show you this video. No, you probably lie to him, right? You tell him this yarn. I mean, it's supposed to be kind of like that. So some of the Mahayana Sutras, I mean, famously the Lotus Sutra, they say that all the early material, the Buddha, yeah, he was just saying those things because you guys weren't mature enough then to handle kind of the real message or the better message. So they're polemicizing against the earlier texts. Not all Buddhists accept the Mahayana Sutras. This is why, because they don't think they are genuine. They try to, many of them try to pass themselves off as genuine by starting off saying, thus have I heard, right? And kind of cluing you in that it's supposed to be the same sort of thing. Third hijacking was, in modern times, since about the second half of the 1800s, by what scholars call Buddhist modernists. And Buddhist modernists really kind of gave a total makeover to Buddhist doctrine to make it more saleable in the modern marketplace of ideas and to help it compete against other religions. And interestingly, they did this using transcendentalism and other Western ideas. This is a really good book on the topic called The Making of Buddhist Modernism. It's by a Buddhist. He doesn't see anything wrong with it. He's just like, well, religion's changed. What are you going to do? Well, not all Buddhists are quite that free-flowing. Look, if you think that this was true all along, why are we going to accept people coming up with something very different in the 20th and 21st centuries? Here's an example of Buddhist modernism. You may have heard the claim, which is constantly repeated in popular presentations, even in places like PBS, BBC documentaries. They'll very often strongly emphasize that in Buddhism, the founder is just a man. Just a man. Why would they be saying that? Well, I mean, it's to compete with Christianity. In the 19th century, a lot of people said, what? Jesus is supposed to be a God-man? That doesn't make any sense. Really? How could you be both the divine and human at the same time? Well, in our religion, this is Buddhist modernism, the founder is just a man, just like me or you. It's just that he made some great discoveries. This is very misleading at best, I would say. It leaves out quite a lot. So this is a quote from Buddhist scholar Rupert Gethin from a widely read book about Buddhism. And he's summarizing the context of one of the early Pali Canon Sutras. He says, in becoming a Buddha, he goes beyond such categories of being as human and divine. Asked whether he was a god or some kind of angel or demon, he replied that he was none of these. Asked if he was a human being, he replied that he was not. So what is the Buddha? Okay, and now he starts quoting the text. Just as a blue, red, or white lotus born in water and grown up in water, having risen above water, stands unstained by water, even so do I, born in the world and grown up in the world, having overcome the world, dwell unstained by the world. Understand that I am a Buddha. Okay, so back to Gethin, he says, a Buddha is thus a being sui generis. It's in its own category, is what that means. A Buddha is just a Buddha. What's a Buddha? I mean, it wouldn't be inaccurate to describe the concept as the concept of a super deity. In Buddhism, they accept, in traditional Asian Buddhism, they accept the existence of traditional deities, like found in India, deities like Indra and Brahma. But they think that these deities are trapped in samsara. They're trapped in the realm of rebirth. And so they too need to get the cure. Now, what's a Buddha? Well, it's a super powerful, transcendent being. Sometimes they describe him as all-knowing, the conqueror of the world, savior of the world, and so on. I mean, the Buddha is you could say that he's a Devati Deva, the god beyond the gods. Or you could say he's greater than any god, or like I said before, a super god, though that's not their term. Okay, so, and we won't even get into the three bodies of the Buddha doctrine in Mahayana. Let it suffice to say that, yeah, to say that the Buddha is supposed to be just a man is highly misleading if you're talking about any kind of traditional Asian Buddhism. Now, so what about these hijackings? Who cares? I mean, why even call them hijackings, Tuggy? Are you trying to be obnoxious? No, I mean, I'll say why I think it matters. Buddhism has always presented itself as, however you like to say it, the revelation or the discovery of a super being. And if that's right, then how come people keep coming along and radically changing the message? I know there's stories about this, you know, the time wasn't right, so the Mahayana Sutras had to be hidden away, and so on. But I don't know, there's a lot of human creativity in this story. And so to me, it kind of reduces the likelihood of the whole thing. Your mileage may vary. All right, let's get a little more serious. One of the central teachings in the Pali Canon Sutras is in English called the no-self doctrine. And so just to give an illustration of it, take a proper name like Dale, or insert your name here. That does refer, but it doesn't refer to a being. It doesn't refer to an entity. What it refers to is just an ever-changing flow of momentary mental and physical things. They call them skandhas in the early texts. Later on, they call them dharmas. They're kind of like fundamental particles, except a lot of them are mental, and they only exist at a moment. So at every moment, there's just a different collection of fundamental realities, and it gives off the illusion of a lasting, real being. They say something with self-being or with its own reality. And that, according to them, is a mistake. The idea seems to be that if you realize that fundamentally they really aren't selves, then this will help people to be less concerned what happens to themselves and maybe make them less greedy and self-interested and so on. Two analogies to try to explain the meaning of this. Think about a cloud. Right, when you were a little kid, you look up in the sky, maybe you sort of imagine that a cloud is like a big puffy cotton ball up in the sky. If you could get up there, you could jump around on it. It'd be really cool to just leap around on this cotton ball. But I mean, then your airplane flies through one of those clouds and you realize, oh, a cloud isn't a thing. It's no more or less than just a bunch of evaporated water molecules. That's all it is. And every second, it's a different collection of molecules, right? So if you see this cloud float across the sky, I mean, there really isn't anything that's moved across the sky, strictly speaking, right? Because every single moment, you're talking about a different collection of droplets. And so when you really think about what a cloud is, according to science, it sort of just dissolves away under the analysis. And if you're going to count up the beings in reality, it looks like you shouldn't count clouds among them. Okay, well, that's what they're saying about what's sitting in your chair. Another analogy, and this is an analogy that they do sometimes use. Think about a flame on the top of a candle. Say you have a candlelight dinner and you're watching the flame and you say, well, that little flame, he's been dancing there for the last hour. No, he hasn't. I mean, you can call him flamey or whatever you want to call him. It doesn't really matter what you call it. The point is that a flame is no more or less than just some combustion events. And if you think that a flame is something in addition to those events, well, you just don't properly understand flames. I mean, a different way to put it is you just project reality onto the flame. You don't discover that there is a flame. Okay, and so that's what they're saying about selves. That a true view of the world, what you'll do is you'll realize that they're merely projected, or sometimes they say they have merely conventional reality. There's a famous passage in the Pali Canon where one of the disciples asked the Buddha, what happens when you obtain nirvana? Will you continue to exist or not? And the Buddha gives a very fascinating and frustrating answer. He says no to both, that you'll survive and that you won't survive. No to both. And he says no to both individually, then he says no to both together. And then he says also not neither one of them. So not A, not B, not A and B, and neither A nor B. That's all wrong. What? What's he doing? Is he just messing with their minds? No, I don't think he's messing with their minds. What you're supposed to get is that the guy's question presupposes that there are selves. And what the guy is asking is what happens when one obtains nirvana? Does the self cease to exist? And his answer is no. Because there isn't anything there to cease to exist. Right? If I lick my fingers and pinch the top of the candle, the flame disappears, and you say, oh no, you've murdered Flamey. No, there's nothing that you have made to stop to exist. It's just certain events have ceased. Certain processes are no longer continuing, that's it. Right? And if you wanted to know where it went, like if you start looking around under the table, like that's just a mistake. It didn't go anywhere, nor was it destroyed. Now, I don't think this is true. I mean, tie me down and call me a selfish SOB, but I think I exist. I agree with Descartes, the early modern French philosopher, who pointed out that when you're conscious, you, at that moment, know that you exist. So, say you're remembering your day and you're thinking about the SpongeBob SquarePants theme song while you're brushing your teeth at night. And look, what you're directly aware of is not just that there is thoughts of SpongeBob theme song and that there is memory of your day. Right? What you're aware of is that you are remembering your day and that you are singing the SpongeBob song to yourself, right? Or to put it different, that's a stupid example. To put it differently, if you're in pain, you're not just aware that someone has tooth pain or that there is a tooth pain present here, you're aware that I am in pain, right? So that you're thereby aware of yourself. And it looks like Descartes pointed out no one could even, in principle, fool you about that. Another great early modern philosopher named Thomas Reid, a Scottish philosopher, makes another interesting point. Not only do you know that you exist now, but you know that you existed some time ago. And you know this by memory. So if you clearly, strongly right now remember that you had eggs for breakfast this morning, we all think that you know that you had eggs for breakfast this morning. Okay, but you're not remembering that someone had eggs this morning, or there was an egg eating earlier, or something like that. You remember, I had eggs. I, who am now thinking this, ate eggs this morning. Okay, well then you existed back then, and so you exist now. It looks like then you know that you've existed for some time now. Okay, but these are all things that the no-self doctrine denies. They don't think that there are real lasting selves. And I mean, I think just by common sense, everybody in fact knows that they are real and that they last through time. I think this is what most Buddhists think. At least when they're not discussing Buddhist philosophy, they believe that they exist, and they think they've existed for some time now, and they hope that they exist in the future. And they're kind of wondering what's going to happen to them in the future, right? Not what's going to happen to somebody, what's going to happen to me. This is an illustration made by Asian Buddhists of one of the Buddhist hells. One of the places you can be reborn is in many different hell realms. There are hot hells and cold hells. Just if you want to find some entertaining stuff and you like gory humor, you should Google Buddhist hells and look at the images. It's kind of a popular subject for art, and it has been for a while, especially in East Asia. So this poor guy here, he's just been skinned alive by those two demons. See, the one on the right's holding up his face, skin. And I don't remember this text, but I'll bet you that what happens is they put the skin back on and do it again, and this happens for 1,000,000 years or whatever. Buddhist hells, they don't last forever, but you might have to suffer for a very long time, and then hopefully you'll get reborn in a better place. Right, but never mind all the gory details of hell. Just think about what is the point of this lore of hells. They're trying to motivate you to not do terrible things like commit adultery or desecrate an image of the Buddha or steal from a temple. Or they're trying to say, no, you don't want to do that, my friend, because if you do that, you might end up in this hot hell where you have to climb spiky trees naked over and over. And it's to motivate you, right? But the whole thing presupposes that you exist, and you can exist after this life. You can be reborn again in a worse place, or you could be reborn in a better place. This is an image of the Buddha called Amitabha. This is not the original Buddha, but another one in Buddhist literature, also called in Japanese Amida, or in Chinese Amituofo. And this Buddha is very nice, and if you put your faith and trust in him and say his mantra a certain number of times, when you die, he will come with his retinue and pick you up and bring you to his pure land, his Buddha realm that he presides over, a blissful, wonderful place that will be an easy step to enlightenment after that. And so, you know, millions of Pure Land Buddhists have this as a hope for what's going to happen to them the next time around. This is a popular school in Japan and in China. Now, my point right now is just that the whole thing presupposes that you exist and that you can exist in the future. And that if you know what's good for you, you will take advantage of this generous Buddha, which will transfer infinite stores of merit to you if you will but do him a small amount of service. Then this can be your future destination. Now, about rebirth, I have two complaints about it. Right, this is what other people call reincarnation. I think, this is my opinion, maybe you disagree, I think that belief in rebirth is unjustified. I don't think it's enough that they say that there's rebirth, or that a few people come up with memories that they claim are of past lives. I've never heard a plausible explanation that just didn't seem like kind of an ad hoc, made-up explanation why most people don't have these memories. I'd be very interested in discovering if I had a whole bunch of past lives, but I don't have any scrap of memory of it. And most likely everybody in this room would agree, maybe one or two wouldn't. Another thing about the scheme I find difficult is the idea of karma without God. So karma is supposed to be that you get what you deserve. If you do good things will happen to you, and most importantly, your next birth, you'll be moving up to a better state of existence. If you do rotten things, then karma ensures that you'll be moving into a crummier next life. That's very strange. How does that work? I mean, it looks like you'd have to have an all-knowing, super powerful, just judge to accomplish this. Someone who knew everything about you, and then they could determine what it was that you deserved. It's difficult, this idea that there's just sort of some kind of impersonal law of nature that just causes people to get what they deserve somehow. And there's another principle that I think is something that people know by common sense, which is that if X is an ancestor of Y, then X existed before Y, right? So your grandpa existed before you did. And I think this is something we know. In fact, grandpa was one of the causes that led to your existing. There was grandpa and grandma, and then there was your mom and dad. And if you don't know how that works, go ask your mom or dad. But anyway, that's why you exist, right? And the cause has to come before the effect. So that's why the ancestor has to exist before the descendant. But rebirth is inconsistent with this. According to this, we've all been around for who knows how long, an indefinite period of time. You might be wondering, who is this scary guy on the right? This is the traditional Indian deity of death called Yama, which you'll frequently see him in art galleries around the world. And he's holding a chart of the 6 realms of rebirth. And so this is, you know, right in the early texts as well, that there are these 6 realms, and you can order them from bad to good. They are the realm of the gods, the devas, the realm of the demigods, or the asuras. There's the human level, there's the animal level, then there are hungry ghosts that are these sad beings that wander the earth in Asian lore. And then at the bottom here, the biggest area, these are the hells, with the hot hells and the cold hells there. And yeah, you might wonder why exactly those 6 and so on. My second complaint about rebirth is that I think it's not a coherent doctrine, right? If there's no self, then there's nothing that makes that future person me or you, right? But I'm supposed to anticipate surviving and then modify my behavior based on that. I want to avoid the hell realms. I want to get a better rebirth, come back as a Buddhist monk so I can get nirvana. But if there's no self, then what do those future people have to do with this here? If there's nothing to reincarnate, is another way to put it. Right? A lot of Asian believers in reincarnation, Hindus, they don't have this problem because they do have something that is transferred. Another word for reincarnation in the West, they call it the transmigration of souls, right? Because you have one soul going from body to body, right? But there is no soul, according to no self doctrine. There isn't any substantial lasting person. So this doesn't seem to make sense. Now, Buddhist philosophers, this is not news to them. They've been engaging with this problem for quite a long time. A classic source here is called The Questions of King Milinda, which is a discussion between probably a real king, also called Menander in history, and a Buddhist monk named Nagasena. And, you know, Menander says, well, if you don't think there are selves, who do you think you're talking with? And the monk explains that names are just convenient designations to refer to these ever-changing flows of mental and physical events. And, you know, they point out that there could be causal connections between the one that dies and this life in the future. And there could be similarities between the one that dies and this future life. Yeah, but that's not going to make that me, right? So to me, these answers kind of ring hollow. I don't think there is a satisfactory answer to that. Now, some Buddhists nowadays just abandon rebirth, just ignore it. Okay, that's one way to go. Then I won't have this objection. Another reason why I'm not a Buddhist is I find that there's a profound pessimism that's in the tradition, that's right there from the beginning. It's a visceral rejection of kind of the value of this life and of ordinary pursuits. And you've already seen this in the diagnoses and cures that I presented. So when Westerners talk about reincarnation, they think that's a groovy thing. Like, wow, man, maybe you don't cease to exist when you die. Maybe you'll come back a whole bunch of more times. So Westerners think it's really a charming idea for exactly that reason. In the Buddhist context, that you're trapped in the realm of rebirth is supposed to be a terrible thing. It's supposed to be a futile and huge misfortune. Life is suffering. All of life, all of samsara is characterized by unsatisfactoriness, they say. Wow, I mean, that's pretty heavy stuff, right? And if it's really a problem, if it's a fundamental problem that you have, that you make distinctions between things, then, I mean, that's telling you that perception, that science, that memory, that ordinary relationships, these are all distractions, right? Because they involve making distinctions. They entangle you in views, some Mahayana philosophers would say. And so, you need to get beyond those. And this is profoundly pessimistic, right? Think about the claim that's in all the early texts, that strong desire is what's keeping you here. It's the hindrance to getting the cure. Well, look, isn't some strong desire appropriate and important? Isn't it important to be attached to and have strong desires for your children or your spouse or your friends? I mean, why not just go all in that way? Why try to hold back? At least if what's in the bounds of right and wrong, if you're on the right side of that line, what's wrong with strong desire? Yeah, and why agree that all thinking is ultimately a hindrance? Here's an interesting quote. This is from a book written by one of the best recent experts on Mahayana Buddhist philosophy, a guy named Paul Williams. And he was a Tibetan Buddhist for several decades. And then he shocked and dismayed all of his Buddhist friends by converting to Roman Catholicism. After years of sneaking around and reading Catholic books on the sly, like it was pornography, he says, and hoping that nobody would recognize him in the bookshop, in the Catholic bookshop. Anyway, it's an interesting read. He's an interesting guy. I had read his books on Indian Buddhist philosophy and on Mahayana schools. They're really very good. They're very precise and informed. And he has this interesting anecdote from his own life. He says, a distinguished Tibetan teacher once came over to me while I was looking out a window at wonderful British patchwork country scenery. The flowers were out, the birds were singing, sheep meandered gently across the turf. In the distance were steep hills fragrant with old ruined abbeys and castles, the mythology of ages. Ah, beauty, he said to me softly. Yes, I saw beauty once. Now all I see is death and destruction. He wasn't joking, right? He was being perfectly serious. He wasn't trying to be a Debbie Downer. It's just, that's sort of something that goes hand in hand with Buddhist philosophy. So I find that I have a visceral reaction to this. I like things in the world. I think this life is full of wonderful people, and I don't see just death and destruction. I guess I do see that, but I also see all the life, and think life in the world is worth preserving, not trying to get around or escape from somehow. That's all I have. Thanks for your attention. We have time for questions. Don't be shy. Any question or comment is good.
So
Hugh?
That second hijacking you mentioned, where sort of fake texts were in Sanskrit, does that have any relation to sort of the incorporation of Buddhism into Hindu theology?
You mean the like the tantric aspect of later Buddhist tradition, or?
Well, I know that like.
Or you mean the
Buddha was sort of incorporated as an incarnation within Hinduism.
Oh, yeah. I mean, I think that was Hinduism trying to steal the Buddhist thunder. Hinduism and Buddhism competed hard in India for more than 1,000 years. And eventually the Hindus won, although with an assist from the Muslims, I think. And one of the ways they tried to co-opt Buddhism and sort of head it off was they said that the Buddha, Gautama, the original Buddha, was an avatar of the god Vishnu, but he came down as the avatar, the Buddha, in order to deceive a bunch of naughty demons with false doctrine. So, I mean, they're not saying Buddhism is awesome and we agree with it and we want it to be part of Hinduism. Not exactly. Sometimes Hindus will say that nowadays, but in the Middle Ages, it was what I said. They said that basically that God came down to deceive bad beings that deserve deception, and he did it as the Buddha. Now about faking the sutras, were they faked? I mean, nobody really knows. They might, the people that wrote the Mahayana Sutras might have been practicing active remembrance meditation, where they're trying to like visualize like a whole sermon and conversation with the Buddha. And they might have believed that that was like a real revelation, maybe even a window into the past. So they could have written them in good faith, but I mean, they're just not from the time that they claim to be from, you know. Steve?
Yeah, I'm wondering why doesn't Buddhism run into trouble just in the idea that there's an individual perspective? And so even if you thought the self didn't last for very long, for the short period of time in which you have a unified individual perspective, doesn't that show, at least for a short period of time, that there is a self, whoever is the subject of that perspective?
Yeah, they just deny that mental states or mental events have to have a subject. So what you're calling their perspective is just the mental state itself. Right? Arguably, it's part of common sense that properties or features have to have possessors, right? If you say, I experienced outrage today, and someone says, oh, you were outraged? Nope, it wasn't me. Oh, okay, so you experienced. So you encountered an outraged person? Oh, nope, just outrage. Just, it was running free. There's just some outrage, I encountered it. I mean, people would think you're nuts because they think, well, any case of outrage has to be somebody's outrage, right? So they just flat deny that. They think these skandhas or dharmas are basic and selves are merely constructed out of them.
One other thing about another problem they might run into. They want to have no desires, but don't they have to have a second order desire not to have any desires? So aren't they committed to the value of desires?
Yeah.
A second order desire?
Yeah, I mean, someone might say, doesn't the Dalai Lama desire breakfast, so he has breakfast, and he desires to tie his shoes, so he ties his shoes. I mean, I think that's why I said cravings are strong desires. Like, I think you have to interpret them as meaning desires that are so strong that you'll be like seriously pained or frustrated if you don't get it met, if you don't meet the desire.
But don't they have frustrated second order desires? They really strongly desire not to have desires?
I think you're supposed to have like a low-level desire for enlightenment or nirvana, because I mean, they would agree that you shouldn't like get caught up in it and like try hard, because that would be a craving. So, I mean, I think that's a consistent thing for them to reply.
Let me talk about my background. So I've read some Buddhism. I guess if I had to describe myself as something, I'd be a Christian Buddhist.
Okay. Zen practitioner? No?
Long story, but anyway, I think you misinterpreted a lot of it, or most of it. And partially by picking and choosing different branches and how they're in opposition to each other, which I think you could do with Christianity.
Which school do you follow? Tibetan or?
Not one in particular, but let me just
Madhyamaka?
The desire. I mean, that's one simple part of it.
Mm-hmm.
The general idea is not just desire, but it's attachment. There's things that we like and we try to grasp them and hold on to it in a changing world. Eventually we're going to be forced to let go. And there's also aversion, things that we don't like, we push away from them in an ever-changing world. I mean, we're in a battle with things, trying to hold on to things that aren't going to last forever and push against things that we don't like. And it's letting go of that grasping and pushing away and fully experiencing things, fully experiencing joys, which I think is the opposite of Debbie Downer. You can get a much deeper appreciation of the world and to let go of that trying to hold on to things, that battle of grabbing and pushing away and just...
Yeah, no, that's consistent with what I said.
Let it be is, I think, at least that's the way that I understand.
Yeah. I mean, some of the emphasis on spontaneity and just going with the present, I really think does come from Buddhist modernism, but I mean, there are elements of it as well. You are not supposed to dwell on the past, and you're not supposed to worry about the future. Sorry?
Those are two of the three noble truths, which is the foundation of Buddhism, right? That's the interpretation of it.
Yeah, I mean, that's what I was summarizing, Four Noble Truths in the diagnosis and cure that I gave.
For example, the stuff on self, which I'm not as clear on. I mean, I've heard people say you try to understand it intellectually, you never will. So I don't know if that helps us philosophers.
Well, that's a Zen type view. I mean, that they think you'll get entangled in a thicket of views if you try to figure it out at all. But analysis is what all the early tradition is about. If you look at the Abhidharma literature. Sorry?
What do we identify as ourself? And so there are these processes of thought or whatever, but there's also this idea that everything's interdependent. That we don't exist separate from everything else.
Yeah.
You don't exist separate from your parents. You don't exist separate from the whole universe. The sun, if there wasn't the sun, you wouldn't exist. If there wasn't partners,
They think it's important to observe causes and effects, and they give standard lists of those and so on.
Right, so
yeah.
There's this thing we think about as ourselves and experience of ourselves, and they don't deny that I'm a separate being walking around here. But it's...
if you mean something with substantial reality or something that exists in its own right, that's precisely what they deny. I mean, what they don't deny is that it appears that this is an individual distinct from other individuals, right? Later
identify with the self, at least my understanding. I mean, there's a truth. They also have the concept of true self.
Yeah, again, that's like Zen.
Kind of contradictory.
Yeah, that's the Mahayana metaphysics there. Your true self is the ultimate reality. Yeah.
And the one thing I thought that was part of the stuff, at least from my understanding, is the karma. Nobody outside is imposing karma on us and punishing us for good or bad. Karma is just cause and effect. If you do things,
yeah, it's supposed to be like a law of nature.
To other people, it creates experiences when in yourself say that are going to be painful.
Yeah, but it's not just the common sense sort of observation that if you're nice, people are more likely to be nice to you. It's supposed to be a kind of cosmic principle that governs how rebirth functions, right?
It's a principle of cause.
It's what sorts people into those six realms, traditionally.
I would say a lot of Buddhism doesn't believe in reincarnation. I mean, met Buddhism and so
that's true of current day.
Different. It's that we're always changing, we're always dying, and being reborn in every moment because we're always changing into something different.
Yes, and sometimes they reinterpret the six realms of rebirth as kind of like six states of mind.
So
they sort of allegorize it or make it not literal.
The karma, if you have done a lot of these things, that you'll suffer from having done bad things in your life. It's a natural effect of that cause of having done poor things. Trouble your consciousness or something like that. So you could end up with those cycles.
Yeah.
Well,
Sir.
Here, I have no previous knowledge of Buddhism. And in this short presentation, you quoted Buddha basically denying the self. Neither known. And then immediately, you went into the concept of hell. And I would like to know if that's accurate, how does somebody reconcile those two? If there is no self, then why should I worry about hell?
Basically, yeah, that's that coherence problem that I said that Buddhist philosophers have been working on since probably before the time of Christ. Some of what's the early philosophical literature called the Abhidharma literature. So, I mean, there was a now extinct branch of Buddhism called the Puglavadins who said actually there is a self and this explains rebirth, but they were heretics and they died out. So what they do is they try to come up with a model where there can be a relation between all this stuff that's going on, these physical and mental events, and some future person or multiple persons. Some Buddhists would say that multiple future, if I could say, life streams count as rebirths of this one. So they theorize along these lines about how there could be causal connections between them. So basically, if I die, whatever's going on mentally could somehow continue to have effects, and this enters into another life stream, what looks like the life of a being. It's ideas like that. But what he said was true. I mean, a lot of Western Buddhists and a lot of modern day Buddhists just flat, they're not interested in rebirth. They don't think it's plausible. They want Buddhism to be scientific, and this doesn't seem to fit in. And but I mean, it's pretty prominent, you know, in not just the oldest kind of Buddhism, but in living Asian Buddhism, like you find in places like Japan and Korea and China. So it's a philosophical problem. It's never made sense to me, honestly.
Part of that could be the hijacking over time, right? Cultures pile on different layers. Same thing happened with Christianity, right? You can see that Christianity went through different Constantinople or whatever, or different, where they chose what the canon is and what's in and what's out. And so cultural layers happen.
That's another conversation. But yes, there is.
What happened in Christianity is.
Yeah. Any religious tradition goes through big changes, and I guess it's up to the people in that tradition to decide when those are legitimate changes and when they're hijackings. So I mean, it's them who gets to decide, not me. But I find some of these changes disturbing when the people coming in with the new stuff keep winning, so to speak, and sort of going almost unchallenged. So, yeah, but like. Those facts, those three hijackings, I mean, they don't call them that, okay, but those are not disputed facts among historians, among Buddhist historians. Now, among your average lay Buddhist believer, some of them don't know some of those facts, like they think the Mahayana Sutras are all genuine and so on. And maybe they think they're the same age as the earlier ones. Some of them deny some of those, what I think are facts. Some of them just accept them and just really don't care that much about the history. It's more about just the practice or about the ritual. So there's a lot of different attitudes there. Steve?
If at least the main line of Buddhism thinks that there's a god, a super god, or someone sort of rises above the water. And on the other hand, they also think there's only oneness, that everything's one, and yet everything's not identical to this sort of alpha god. How do those two fit together? Are they on different lines of Buddhism, or is it a contradiction?
I mean, arguably they don't fit together, but what Mahayana metaphysicians say is they distinguish the three so-called bodies of the Buddha. There's the ultimate reality as it is in itself. They call that the truth body. And then there's the Buddhas that manifest in the Buddha realms that they call enjoyment bodies. And then the Buddha that was walking around in India more than 2,000 years ago, they call that an emanation body. It's like a magical projection. And so the real Buddha, as it is that indescribable ultimate reality. That's what they would say. These other things get subordinated into basically like appearances or manifestations of that one thing. But, you know, this is for highfalutin metaphysicians. Ordinary Buddhists, you know, that take refuge in the Buddha, you're putting your trust in the Buddha, you're trying to honor him using the images, giving incense, money, and so on, hoping to make merit. And I mean, they do interact with the Buddha in a way that you could call worship in a lot of Asian traditions. Right? If the ultimate reality is just a something, it's not a deity, it's not a personal being, it's not the kind of thing that you would worship, it's the kind of thing that you would maybe try to experience somehow. But so some scholars talk about non-devotional and devotional forms of Buddhism, where the metaphysics people are the non-devotional.
But it's still distinct from everything else. I mean, how can you have oneness if you have this realm or this state or this way of being that's better than the way things normally are? It still seems to be incompatible with the notion that there's a single unified reality.
I'm not sure I'm following you. I mean, all this gets demoted to illusion, right? And so, and you can't make any, the mind is not helpful for beholding this one ultimate. That's what they think. It's similar to Neoplatonism and to Advaita Vedanta Hinduism. I don't know if that's going to help anybody, but they're broadly pretty similar.
Some
Sir.
analogies I've heard more with the self than with the deity is, you know, like, if everything is the ocean and the self is a wave that comes up and exists for a while and then fades, right? It's still part of all together. So it's not separate, but it is its own entity.
Yeah, but it exists.
But it is, yeah.
In some sense it exists, yeah, although maybe as a modification of it. Yeah, sir.
In your analysis of Buddhism, you spoke of your discontent with the doctrine and the cure, and you highlighted several of the distinct modern explanations that arose, which can be compared to Calvinist, Lutheranism, and Roman Catholicism in the Christian Church. You gave an example of the self and the outrage. They would make a separation, and I think a viable comparison would be when somebody from Christianity would say that they were possessed by some sort of demon. Granted, you're not departing from the self, but it is some form of comparison. I guess my question to you is, where do you define the experience with the sacred? The gentleman behind me seems to be a practitioner of Buddhism, so there must have been some sort of experience with the sacred. There's a reason why people follow it, and so my question to you is, what would be the incentives to practice the religion?
What do I make of experiences of the sacred in general? With regards to Buddhism? I mean, in general, I take religious experience seriously because I don't see why it shouldn't be a source of evidence. If it gets discounted as merely subjective and not evidential, I'm not sure why that should be. So I actually think it's a really interesting topic. You can't believe that everybody's religious experience is veridical, that is accurate, because then you'd end up with an incoherent reality. But nobody thinks you should believe everybody's religious experiences, right? If I drink 15 beers and eat a couple of chili dogs and I have some really weird dreams, it doesn't matter what religion it's in, most people are going to say, man, you shouldn't eat those 2 chili dogs on top of all that beer. So what I'm driving at is you have to separate experiences that seem like they should count as evidence from ones that don't. One problem I have in this realm with some of the experiences that we're talking about, say in Zen or in some of the Mahayana texts, is they're claiming they have an experience of an ineffable, of an inconceivable reality. If it's truly ineffable, I don't see how it could be evidence in favor of anything. Like if it's really something that we can't understand to any degree, I don't see then why it would be reason for believing this or that. Like why shouldn't it just be just an experience? And but other experiences, if someone says, I prayed to Avalokiteshvara and think that he rescued me out of my trouble. These are not so easily dismissed because they have content. It seemed to them like some transaction occurred. Maybe they heard or saw something. And in those cases, I don't think there's an easy answer. You just have to ask, what's the best explanation? Is the best explanation given everything else we know? Is it imagination or something, or where it's not a truthful experience? Or is that really what happened? And I don't think it's obvious. So, if someone said they had religious experience while in a Buddhist temple or while meditating, I would just say, well, that's interesting. What were they? And, take it from there.
Isn't it Hinduism that speaks that all paths lead up to the same mountain?
That is a popular theme in modern Hinduism. If you want to read more about this, I have an article online called Theories of Religious Diversity, which is in a free philosophy encyclopedia online. There's a big, long section about this. It's a theme in modern Hinduism that all religions are true, they usually say. which is a little baffling because, you know, if one religion says there aren't any deities and one says there's exactly one and one says there's more than one, like how could they all be true? But then we're off to the races with more developed theories. So yeah, it's an interesting thing in modern Hinduism. Sometimes Buddhists in modern times will say that as well, that all religion really is dealing with the same transcendent reality or something like that. It's the general term for it is religious pluralism, theories of religious pluralism. So
The Buddhist teaching himself say that. That these things are all pointing like pointers, like they're hand pointing at the transcendent moon. People get fixed on the pointers and not what is.
Yep, that's Zen. That's Zen texts. Absolutely, they do say that. Yeah, yeah. Different Buddhist texts. I mean, they can be more and less friendly to other religions. I mean, there's a real healthy sense of competition and rivalry with the Jains and with the Hindus in a lot of medieval Buddhist writing. I mean, they're fighting for their life. They're competing for people's adherence. So they're not so easygoing, but it just depends, right? Because the Zen attitude, yeah, the Zen attitude is doctrine doesn't really matter. I mean, it's really practice that matters and experience, this special kind of experience, right?
So that's one of the, I don't know, it's experience, but one of the teachings says it's sort of different from other religions. You know, in some ways, I don't think Buddhism is a religion. Most religions expect you to have faith in certain things. Buddhism usually doesn't. They say,
yeah, that's
try it for yourself, and if it works, then it works.
Yeah,
you validate it as a individual self, even though there isn't.
Yeah, this is a prominent theme in Buddhist modernism, that other religions say you have to have faith and believe things that don't make sense, and we don't say that. I don't know. Read the historical text.
My mind is limited to one slide where their argument is you can't be alive, you can't be dead, and then that was separate, and then both,
No.
you can't be both. And I'm trying to think, like, how do you go about that in their perspective? Maybe, I don't even know if there's a way around that to prove whether it's valid or invalid, their points.
Well, I mean, what he goes on to say in that text is, look, I never promised I was going to answer questions like this. I'm trying to provide a cure for the problem that ails you, which is to get out of samsara, to get nirvana, and that's it. So, I mean, he's refusing to answer all that you do survive or that you don't survive once you finish the cycle of rebirths and get nirvana. He's not saying that you do, and he's not saying that you don't. He's not saying both, and he's not saying neither. But really, I mean, that's because he thinks they're bad questions, you know. Like the classic example of a leading question or misleading question is, you know, have you stopped beating your wife yet? If you say yes, then you just agreed that you were a wife beater, right? And if you say no, that's also bad. So this is like a gotcha question that a reporter would ask a politician, you know. It's a question with a false presupposition. So he thinks that this guy's concern about what's going to happen to himself is based on a false presupposition, which is that he is a real thing that will continue to exist for some time. So I think that's what's going on. It's hard to shake out of, you know, common sense on this. Like, because you say to yourself, well, what shall I do tomorrow? Well, that presupposes that you will exist tomorrow, that you're thinking that. Yes, did you have a question?
Oh, I'm just curious. I never understood what the different temples were for that maybe are throughout Japan. Are they for the lesser gods or the... I mean, some you might go to worship Buddha, but others you might go to pray to a god who's going to make your marriage stronger or something like that. So who are those deities?
Yeah, I mean, scholars call it the Mahayana pantheon. There's a big bunch, a standard list of Buddhas and Bodhisattvas, you know, Buddhas to be. What are the temples for? I mean, they're generally for worshiping the Buddha and other Buddhas using images. I remember I went to one in California, a big, beautiful one made by Chinese Buddhists, and in the main hall was a big, giant statue of the original Buddha. And then there was, I think, Amitabha on one side, and I forget who was on the other side, one of the other prominent ones. Are you praying for answers to specific problems? Yes, in a lot of cases. And one thing that people have a hard time understanding about Buddhism with a Christian or Muslim background is when Buddhism moves into an area, they don't say, okay, we're the religion in town, you should forget all the old stuff. What they do is they sort of vacuum up and assimilate the old stuff. So whatever traditional pantheon you had before, it's fine if you need to get some good crops, or you're having trouble conceiving, or you want good luck for your business ventures. You maybe for these kind of practical purposes can appeal to other deities, whatever. But we're here to talk about enlightenment, or anyway, getting the final cure. And those traditional deities can't help you with that. But the Buddhas can, either by following their teaching or by getting their merit transferred to you and things like that. So, yeah, I mean, what goes on, you know, can differ by school. Zen, like, isn't really devotional. So, I mean, they do kind of perfunctorily honor images and so on, but, you know, you'll find the Zendo, the meditation hall there. But generally, you know, you'll see images set up in the front, and the purpose is worship. Mm-hmm.
So,
and there's a lot of relics a lot of times, like a bit they think is of the Buddha's ashes, or a tooth, or things like this, which they believe, you know, has power because in some sense maybe he's present there. Sorry.
Sorry, I was just going to say, so what's the significance of worship, or thinking that these pieces of the Buddha have power, these relics have any sort of relevance, if ultimately reality, like the supreme reality, is just an impersonal force, you know, like we think of worshiping God because God gets something out of it, and it may even be beneficial for us.
Yeah. Well, I mean, a lot of Buddhists don't think that the Buddha is an impersonal, you know, inconceivable something, I think is maybe the answer. This honoring relics seemingly arose before the making of images and possibly led to it. I don't know. But after he died, he was cremated, and then they buried his remains in, I think it was 8 monuments. And then another king came along and divided those 8 monuments worth of ashes into hundreds of them. And some of these are still around. And so you go and walk around them and honor the Buddha in this way. And they, you know, they think that it's kind of a technology they think that they can interact with the Buddha through. I mean, they think there is power in it. So, okay, we've ran maybe a little bit too late. Thanks so much for your time and attention. I'll stay around and talk. Appreciate it.